Current situation and further trends of inclusive education in Mongolia. Welcome to the Inclusive Education Law course. In this tutorial, we focus on the development of inclusive education in Mongolia. Mongolia ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2008. This tutorial responds to the following questions. What is the conceptual framework of inclusive education in Mongolia? Which law reforms and policy developments took place to implement the rights of persons with disabilities in Mongolia? What research on the Mongolian situation is carried out? What are the outputs? What are the further perspectives on disability policies? What is the significance of the introduction of inclusive education for the educational system? The implementation of inclusive education requires changes in education policies, attitudes, learning environments, teacher training methods, and attitudes to accommodate the needs of students with special needs and eliminate barriers impeding their right to education. An inclusive education environment is an accessible environment that welcomes all students in regular classes in their own neighborhood schools. It provides support and takes care of their learning difficulties. It enables students with disabilities to contribute and participate in all aspects of school life. The school environment is designed to foster inclusion of students with disabilities. The entire education environment must be accessible, including buildings and classrooms. Curricula must be updated and include a course on inclusive education. Teaching methods should be adapted, etc. Which law reforms and policy developments took place to implement the rights of persons with disabilities in Mongolia? In 2017, the government adopted Resolution number 46 on some measures to implement the law on human rights of persons with disabilities. The state policy on education from 2014 till 2025 develops a forward-looking educational system. The National Programme on Supporting Citizens with Disability Rights, their participation and development from 2018 till 2022 supports the implementation of the regulation. The Mongolian education policy constitutes a commitment to the implementation of Education 2030, the so-called Incheon Declaration and Framework for Action towards Inclusive and Equitable Equality Education and Lifelong Learning for All. The Constitution of Mongolia recognizes the right to education of each citizen. The Law on Education of 2006 regulates the educational system. Article 13.3 of the Law on Primary and Secondary Education states that all secondary schools should provide conditions for educating children with disabilities. Article 13.12 of the Law on Primary and Secondary Education states that teachers and social workers working at secondary schools should have knowledge of special needs education and knowledge of teaching methods and strategies for teaching and supporting students with disabilities. According to Article 9.9 of the Law on Preschool Education, in a regular kindergarten, the number of children with a mild type of disability may not exceed 2 in a group. The Law on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 2016 makes special education and teaching methods and strategies for teaching and supporting students with disabilities mandatory in curricula of teacher training at universities and colleges. The Ministry of Education, Culture and Science of Mongolia, Order and Statement A-155, regulates the module for the individual education plan and the procedures for its development. The Ministry of Education, Culture and Science of Mongolia, Order and Statement A-292, regulates inclusive education of children with disabilities at regular schools. The Ministry of Education, Culture and Science of Mongolia Order and Statement A 425 regulates procedures for the assessment of students and the quality of achievements of students in general education. So what research on the Mongolian situation is carried out? What are the outputs? The project supporting inclusive education aimed at identifying the difficulties and needs when creating conditions for inclusive education for children with disabilities. The Needs Assessment Survey supporting every child for inclusive education principle in Mongolia analyzed the legal documents on inclusive education and the difference of understanding of content and concepts among professionals, teachers and parents. The Enrollment Policy Index showed a high rate of school enrollment, however, low levels of flexibility and adjustment in education. Interagency cooperation and support between the parties was insufficient. The survey supporting children with special needs dealt with the questions: what special support and attention does a student with special needs get, and what was the impact on the development of the child? The comparative study of child development assessment systems and the survey supporting every child for inclusive education in Mongolia found that children with special educational needs need support and that a further nationwide study should be conducted. There is an urgent need to raise awareness and improve the knowledge about special needs with teachers and parents and how children with special needs in education should be provided support. So what are the further perspectives on disability policies? Policy documents should be updated and clarified in terms of inclusive education principles and values. A new law on special needs and inclusive education should be adopted and other legal provisions should be amended. Training programs should be updated and include pre- and in-service teacher training in inclusive education. For each program, methodology textbooks and guidebooks on inclusive education should be developed or translated, and practice should be provided within each course. The development of the child should be assessed in accordance with international standard methodologies by a Child Development Support Center. A survey on the prevalence of children with special educational needs in Mongolia should be conducted. The legal status of special needs teachers to work at regular schools should be elaborated. What is the significance of the introduction of inclusive education for the educational system, which is the purpose of the Erasmus Plus MELINC project? The project aims at updating the curriculum of teacher training in Mongolian universities through the introduction of a modular course on inclusive education. It provides online training content and video tutorials and conducts face-to-face and online trainings. It establishes SEND centers for counseling and providing services for students with special needs in education and their families. The Mongolian National University of Education will introduce modules on inclusive education in a number of programs. It will also operate the SEND Counseling Center and provide advice and support to students with special needs in education and to their families in the central part of Mongolia. Dornat University will introduce modules on inclusive education in a number of programs. It will also operate the SEND Counseling Center and provide advice and support to students with special needs in education and to their families in the eastern part of Mongolia. KAFT University will introduce modules on inclusive education in the Bachelor of Pedagogy and in the Master of Pedagogy. It will also introduce a mandatory short-term in-service teacher training course and an elective short-term training for secondary school teachers in the region. It will also operate the SEN Counseling Center and provide advice and support to students with special needs in education and to their families in the western part of Mongolia.